For a couple of weeks, I've been down a particularly interesting rabbit hole here with scripting in Logic. Logic has a scripter which is a MIDI effects. You open it up on a software track just above your instrument, and you can pour some code into it and create fascinating functionalities. So I've created something that I eventually labeled the final boss script here. And that's an amalgamation or something like a modular script. I came up with different kinds of functionalities that I wanted to add to stuff like the Jamstik or Fishman TriplePlay or even MIDI Guitar 3. When it comes to the precise per note modulation of very distinct or specific notes within a chord, for instance. It's rather hard to actually target one note from a particular chord if you want to have that be the only thing that is affected by, say, CC74 or aftertouch or even pitch, or all three at the same time but not affecting anything else. And this script is actually applicable to all kinds of MIDI controllers. I'm also using it together with something like a traditional piano here. And some other controllers, because this hinges on you having some sort of expression controller, be it a pedal or a breath controller, the faders or the knobs on any other controller as well. The only thing you need to know about that fader is what CC does it output or control. This script grew out to be a set of 7 parts, I'd say. A global section to begin with for some MPE settings and other stuff. And then we have the generated envelopes where I add the stuff that you can't get from a Jamstik or something else. So I add aftertouch and I add CC74 and I add lift to the whole mix. And after that, you have a pitch bend mapping, which I find really interesting because we have so few gestures with the guitar. We have strike and we have string bends. And string bends are associated, obviously, with pitch bends, but it doesn't have to be. So I've seen to that you can use your string bends not only for pitch, but also for aftertouch or CC74, or either of these in any kind of combination. We have the dual modifiers section. This is a section where you can add 2 external controllers of any kind. So I'm most often using a breath controller and an expression pedal because to me they offer 2 different kinds of control, but you can use whatever you want. And after this, there's this completely new category. It's an LFO stepper. I felt like I at least wanted to describe that it's possible to do some sort of rough automation. So if you want to switch between 2 target modes in the dual modifier section, you can automate this with the LFO stepper. You can sync it to the Logic tempo, of course, but you also have a free setting for how fast you want it to step through these alternatives. After this comes what I call the MPE Snapshot. It's really something like a sostenuto pedal, but the whole idea with this Snapshot is, of course, a freeze hold pedal that you can play over. But I still wanted the MPE qualities to be intact. So when I snapshot or capture this chord, I'm taking a picture of the chord with all the MPE categories at that particular moment. But the traditional problem with this would be that if you play the identical note on top of a snapshot like this, would negate or cut off or stop the old chord from ringing. So I had to create a specific solution that works, and I'm pretty proud of that, actually. And after that, we have an output and instrument section. And the only time you want to go into that, if the instrument you're playing might not use the 48 pitch bend range, or also decide on what outputs you want to use from this whole script. So if you only want to effect, something like CC74. You can choose that from the list. But they all work together, and the settings are related, of course. It's not just a compound of distinct functionalities. It's very much an extension of your instrument. So it gives me the ability to control these MP dimensions in ways that I even can't do with something like the Rolly C-board. But the comparison to the Rolly C-board is really important, because with the Rolly C-board we have something like 5 dimensions of touch. You have strike, of course, and that's to send the per note velocity messages. And glide is a pitch bend message per note. Slide is a per note CC74 message. And you have something like pressure, and that's to send velocity over time. And you also have lift, which is an interesting note of velocity message. It would seem on the face of it like using a guitar, we're not as well equipped to handle a lot of these dimensions in parallel, given that the kinds of inputs, the kinds of gestures available aren't that many. We're really limited to messages like note on, pitch, pitch bends, and note offs. So my idea was to create as much as I could based on that set of inputs. So from this, I've added a pressure envelope, a CC74 envelope. I also added a lift dimension that depends on how hard you strike and how long you let the note ring for, and a couple of the other things. In short, we have all the dimensions from MP, but we only have 2 gestures really that we can use from the guitar. That would be the strike and the string bends. So we need to add some other gestures, and that's why I'm suggesting you use something like an expression pedal and a breath controller, for instance. I'm going to use a breath controller throughout, and you'll get to see something like a keyboard here, the scripter perhaps here, and also the equator synth, which is the synth that I'm going to use mostly just because of the way it sort of informs you of what's going on. I think it's a great synth that way. I also have a keyboard here, so I'm inputting it via this script right now. If I'm using my breath controller, in this case, we have CC2 here. I've set that to relative and to pitch only, so I'm only controlling pitches. I've set it to go down, and I've set it to go down 1 octave. So it looks like this. So now I'm affecting pitch only with my breath controller, but all the notes. So if I want to go for 1 note, perhaps I could go for the highest note. And if I want it to go upwards instead of downwards, I'll just change that to up here. And let's say I don't want it to move a full octave, then I'll just set it to whatever I want it to move right here. So let's say I want to move just a whole note. Now I have a second modifier here on CC3. That's an expression pedal that I have on the floor. Right now it's set to something that I call the sun feather mode. It's meant to affect pitch only. I've set it to a pitch bend range of 7. It's kind of arbitrary, but that's what it is right now. If I use a chord right now and use the pedal, you're gonna see that spread apart. I can, of course, limit the range. And if I want to use this microtonally, I can use the pitch bend range cents instead. For those of you who have a keen ear, you might hear something right now. If you don't, you can at least see something moving here while I'm upping this. And the fun thing is I can use these together. So I have this sun feather thing where I'm pressing my foot pedal. And I can also use the breath controller to control the pitch on the, in this case, highest note. So let's say I want to move that more than these two semitones. I'll take this up an octave again. So the modifiers in themselves are totally independent, but they can work together. I'm going to go over everything in this script right now with all the possibilities, but you'll see as we go along that you'll have an abundance of control in terms of these 5 dimensions. But let's start from the beginning with the global sections. You see that I have something called strike mode. Strike is essentially velocity. In the O'Reilly keyboard, for instance, strike is how fast you attack one of these key wave sensors. With a guitar, it is how hard you pick a note or tap or pluck a note. So the velocity is going to increase with the amount of energy you're putting into sort of triggering this note. So here you have 2 alternatives really. You have process and you have pass incoming. But this whole script builds almost everything from incoming velocities. So if you set this to pass incoming, that would mean essentially bypassing everything in this script. For the pitch bend mode, you have the same 2 alternatives, process and pass incoming. And there is this global smoothing sensitivity setting that decides how often you update the information coming in. So you should have that pretty low for fast updates and smoother results. Also in this global settings section, we have the MPE zone master settings. This is the place where you decide how you want to use this as an MPE controller. Luckily, we won't have to think about any new MIDI messages because they are all the same. MPE is, in fact, MIDI. The big difference lies with the distribution of MIDI on different channels. With MIDI 1.0, we typically had this monolithic channel assignments where one channel represented a full instrument together with all the expressions like pitch and modulation and stuff like this. And this meant that playing a chord and using the pitch wheel, either you affected just one note or you affected the whole bunch of the notes in the chord, but they were affected in exactly the same way by this pitch wheel action. Imagine if you're a keyboardist looking at how a guitar player can handle his pitches independently of each other. I mean, we can bend one note while having some other note kept in pitch relatively and do all this weird stuff. That is the big motivation, I think, behind the move into MPE, extending these expressive capabilities to each and every note. So now, of course, with stuff like the O'Reilly keyboard, it has more expressive capabilities than a guitar. So it feels kind of funny to me that when we come back with the guitar and try to make this into an MPE controller, we struggle somewhat. But that's obviously because we're trying to use the guitar with a protocol that is developed for something like a keyboard controller initially. With MPE, the difference is we're sending each note on its own channel together with its own pitch, its own modulation, and its own aftertouch. But then you have to think about a new way of sending this. You can't use one channel for a whole instrument. You need to use one channel per voice or per note to be able to have stuff like pitch bend affect only that note and not any other notes. And this is how MPE is structured. So normally you use one channel as a master channel, and you have the remaining 15 to use for voice messages if you want to. For MIDI guitar, for instance, it really doesn't make any sense to have more than 6 channels for the 6 strings, since you can't play more than one note per string. So for MIDI guitar, the natural use is to use channel 1 as a master channel, channel 2 to 7 for the 6 strings. And against that background, we can start looking at the MPE zone master channel settings that we have here. For the MPE zones, we have off, lower zone, and upper zone. So if you want this script to work with a multi-channel setup that isn't really an MPE setup, for a synth that isn't an MPE synth, you can set this to off, and you have access to all the 16 channels without designating any of these as a master channel. But then you have the lower zone and the upper zone, and the lower zone is by far the more standard choice, I guess. But I can at least come to think of one specific setup where you want to use this upper zone setting over the lower zone. And that would be if you're using something like the old school Fishman TriplePlay setup with the output on the first 6 channels, 1 to 6. And you can't change the assignment of these. So for that reason alone, we have these MPE zone assignments here. The next setting is MPE member channels, and it makes no sense to use more than 6 channels for a guitar, because we can't really use 2 notes on the same string, so 1 note per string per channel is the traditional way we're sending information here. It won't make a difference for you if you put this to 8 or something else, but for a very specific reason, and that comes down to the MPE snapshots that I have in the very end of this. You shouldn't set this to use all the 15 channels as MPE member channels, because then you exclude the possibility of using these other channels as something else. And that's exactly what I'm doing with the MPE snapshot. I'm repurposing these other channels specifically so that I can make a hold function. So if you don't see any particular reason for changing these MPE member channels, don't use anything else above 6 and let the other ones be accessible for other functionalities. Then of course you have the MPE master pitch bend range. You can leave this as 48 here, because if you have an instrument that really doesn't work with a 48 pitch bend range setting, you can change that at the very end of this script. Let's move on into the place where I actually add stuff, and that would be the generated envelopes section. So this script is all about adding MPE functionality to existing MIDI controllers, and existing MIDI controllers like the Jamstik, or even a keyboard if you add another script. But let's take 2 steps back. When I first started trying out the Jamstik, I didn't know how much or how little of these MPE qualities that would be able to be controlled with the actual Jamstik. I didn't know how they had solved this problem. I just knew that they told me that this was an MPE controller, but I didn't know how. So this is what I found out when I tried it for the first time. Looking at the Bluetooth connection of Jamstik in a MIDI monitor here, you can see that we have pitch bend, we have the note, and we have a velocity on value, and it's going to be an off value once it reaches 0, I would guess. So if I play D2 and D3 now, you see that we'll get these on separate channels. But what it doesn't send in this case is its string envelope that could be interpreted as aftertouch or CC74. If I were to use the USB-C connection here and connect to my computer, I will get this string envelope, but then I would have to choose between either the aftertouch or CC74. So I can't even get both of these. This is why I'm kind of hesitant calling the Jamstik a full-out MPE controller. And moreover, the quality of that string envelope really made no sense for me. I tried that with a Swarm instrument with the actual Jamstik preset that was set up for that Swarm instrument, and this is how that sounded. But now you get this very dull dynamic profile from the decaying string. And with the Jamstik algorithm to produce MIDI, you have a very fast decay. So you can look at the expression here. That's where the Jamstik string envelope on expression 11 is coming in. So let's start with the settings for the 2 envelopes that I added to remedy the problems of the Jamstik or the Aeroband or a keyboard or whatever. The first thing we have here is the pressure settings, and the second is the CC74 settings. So the idea with these envelopes is I want to keep some of the dynamic profile of a MIDI guitar, in that I have a high transient that is tapering off exactly like a string would. So this is what I went for when I created these envelopes. But you have all the possibilities in the world to shape these with the decay and the attack settings. So the decay will decide for how long this tapering off should go on. The higher the value, the slower the tapering off is. Raising the value on the attack will also give you postponing of this attack, and it gives you a swell feeling, which works really well for brass and for synths. And I'll have to thank Victor from my Patreon for suggesting this. These two settings are the two main shapers of these envelopes, and there is some sort of hierarchy in that these settings in the beginning of the script shapes everything that you have to work with. So when you're adding stuff with the modifiers later on, these are the envelopes that you have to work with. And for each of these envelopes, you have a enable disable button, you have a choice of a curve, and you have a smooth setting. Since this is the place where I wanted to add these MP dimensions, this is where lift appears as well. I tried to emulate as best I could what would be something similar to a fast release of a key for the guitar. So I used velocity, I used runtime, and I used a couple of other parameters to approximate what would be the same thing. The correlation between how I'm attacking a note when I'm intending on letting it go faster, or if I'm intending on letting it linger for a while. For how long it rings will decide on how likely it is that you try to stop it fast. So a note that is very soft and that is very long will most likely have a very small lift effect. But whereas a short note, you try to stop it fast and it should land somewhere in the higher 50% of the lift curves. What you need to know is that the faster the note, the higher the value. That should be the output. If it's not, you can go to the settings and try to emulate that for yourselves. Let's move on into the pitch bend mapping section here. This is really an idea that came to me when I started using the tremolo whammy MIDI bar on the Rob O'Reilly guitar. What if we can use our pitch bends to modulate other stuff? That's the main idea. So I created this little section here in the final boss script where you can check the boxes for which parameters you want to be affected by the pitch bends. You also have settings for how much these pitch bends should influence these other parameters, and a setting for how big a maximum bend is. That would be the same thing as the full throw from the center position of a pitch bend wheel to its maximum or minimum position. With this next section, this was actually the first part of this script that sort of prompted me to go further on and create these envelopes to be handled by this script later on. I created this part of the script for MIDI Guitar 3 actually, to be able to pinpoint certain notes in certain chords, to be able to affect them without affecting the other stuff. Of course, you have the enable modifiers button as always. Then you have a modifiers list. And here you can choose from incoming CC. So if I know that I have my breath controller on CC2, I'm going to choose CC2 from here, and it's going to take on whatever I have connected to CC2 in this case. When I'm going to the modifier mode, choosing from this modifier A mode list, I can choose from global, which affects every note in the chord equally. So it will affect these chord notes in this old school monolith way that I've described earlier, where every note is affected equally by the input. If you go to relative, on the other hand, there's a more discriminatory way of handling stuff. If you have a chord with different dynamic constituents, one of the notes are ringing much stronger than the others. This is still going to be accounted for. The relative difference will still be intact. I can also target stuff like the highest or lowest note, for instance. And then within a chord, I want the highest note to behave in this particular manner. And this is the strength of the effect that I'm applying. This is the kind of effect that I'm choosing. So I can choose from pressure, I can choose from CC74, pitch, or a combination of these, or all. So I can choose the highest note, but apply the effect on all three of these dimensions. So I want pitch to be affected, I want CC74, and I want pressure to be affected in this way, but only the highest note in any chord. Then you have the pitch bend ranges here. And these are, of course, related to the pitch part of this. Not only, though. But first of all, we have a pitch bend range setting in semitones. Then we have a pitch bend range setting in cents. And the latter one is for microtonal work. You can combine these, so you can use 12 semitones plus 1 cent if you want to, for the range that these notes are to be affected in. It's not only affecting the pitch bend range. If you choose the target all and you choose the thing that I'm calling sun feather here, which is a pulling apart of a chord in both directions. Depending on how big this chord is, you will have a center note and 2 notes that goes in either direction. If you have 4 notes, it should spread evenly apart as well. But when you apply that effect also to CC74 and pressure, you will have a skewing effect. And that skewing effect will be dependent on the modifier pitch bend range and the modifier depth as well. You have the modifier polarity. If I want the highest notes pitches to go up, I'll decide that here. Or the stuff that I do often is use one controller for the highest and have that go up, and perhaps set the other ones for the lowest note and have that go down instead. So we're almost just done with this dual modifier section. But if you take a look at the modifier A polarity, you'll see a switching between up and down. And that actually correlates to the modifier A mode, switching between the lowest and the highest. This is something I've automated in the LFO stepper that I'm going to talk about. But I'll just add the keyboard, a breath controller, because the breath controller is on CC2. And I'll use my keyboard here on the side. With the modifier A mode, switching between the highest and the lowest, I should actually be able to play a chord right now and have an effect that switches between the highest notes and the lowest notes from an automation that I did with the LFO stepper. So let's see if that works. I did this yesterday, so. This is one of those super intuitive things that you can do with the LFO stepper. But when I only have this Logic script to go to, it's really not that dynamic. I can't change much about what appears in different menus and stuff like that. All of that needs to be done in advance. I have here the LFO stepper, and you can see that I have 2 LFO steppers. I have LFO 1 and LFO 2. In this case, both are enabled. Depending on how much stuff I put into this, I have 4 steps if I want to use them. In this case, I used 2 steps per modifier function. So I'm just having the modifier A polarity switching between up and down. If I'm not using anything else, it goes between those 2 only. I have an LFO rate as well, but that's not connected right now since I'm using the tempo sync here. So if I'm using the free setting, the LFO rate will be what decides how fast this LFO is switching between these. I have this tempo sync and I have a note division. I also have a play mode. So the forward loop mode, it's going to go over the alternatives and start over. But I also have a ping pong mode where it's going up the list and down the list to start over again. It's the same kind of settings for 2 different steppers here. But in the other LFO stepper, I put modifier A mode highest against the modifier A lowest. This LFO actually controls the switching between these two modes, and the other one is controlling the switching between the up and down. So these are not related in that way. They're only synced together by this LFO stepper. In that way, you can use this LFO stepper as an automation for different kinds of stuff. So it's all the kinds of lists that appear within this script appears here. And also all the kinds of stuff that these lists contain. You can't use everything with everything. If I'm using the modifier A polarity and use something like all, nothing would happen because it's not a proper alternative for that kind of functionality. This is because the scripter is actually limited in some way. I can't do everything with this. What you need to know is what kind of values goes together with what kind of parameters. It's a highly convoluted way of getting some automation into something like this, but this is a script. For anybody that's interested, you can go into the code and change stuff up. You can put new stuff on the list if you want to, or remove stuff that's existing if it's cluttering or something. So now let's go to the MP snapshot section. I think that most of us as guitar players, we have this idea of a pedal that we can step on that freezes everything that we're playing, and then we want to keep playing with the same sound on top of that. There are freeze pedals, and there's this game changer audio plus pedal for acoustic stuff and stuff like this. It shouldn't be as problematic when it comes to MIDI, right? Well, this is what happens if I use the traditional sostenuto pedal with something like Equator. Now I'm freezing this with my sostenuto pedal on CC66, but I'm playing the same notes that are already ringing. I'm still pressing my pedal. So the note off from the notes that I played on top of these, that is the same notes sent on the same channel, telling the synth that there's a note off coming in for that particular pitch on that particular channel. Tells also the frozen note off in the sostenuto pedal to turn off. I needed to find a way for whatever I'm playing on top of the capture that we're freezing to not be able to communicate with the information in that. If you remember in the beginning where I told you not to be greedy and use just 6 of these 15 member channels in the MP settings, this is why. If you stayed with my advice and just use these 6 member channels for voices there, you will have some channels free for something else. And that's exactly what I want to use in this case. So any MP snapshot capture will be copied and moved automatically to any of those channels that I can't reach with the incoming new messages. So I can't access or turn off any of the captures because they're on a completely different channel right now. So that means that we can actually capture a chord with all the MP qualities, send them to another channel, and still keep playing like nobody's business. With the Snapshot CC setting, you can choose anything you want, but I would advise against choosing CC66, because if you do that, you will probably double the effect. You will probably send also the traditional sostenuto command to whatever synth you're playing after this, and you'll double the effect. So I'm just using CC67, which doesn't seem to do much in Equator right now, at least. The settings we have for the MP snapshot section, we have this CC that you have to decide, and I would suggest use anything but CC66 or 64 perhaps as well. Then you have the snapshot velocity. That's a setting for how strong you want the snapshot to be in relation to what you're playing over there. And after that, you'll have a snapshot swell. And this is mostly related to if you want to use this snapshot with a high transient sound. Because once you copy and press the pedal, you will create a new node on for these new channels. If this new node on is somewhat interfering with your playing, it can be somewhat mitigated by using this swell. But then you also need to decide what kind of swell target you have. If it's an MPE instrument, you are probably best off using the channel pressure. But if it's something like an acoustic guitar, you might want to use the volume instead. So you get the swell on CC7 instead. That's what that is for. Finally, we're down to the last section with the output instrument section. And you only have two settings here, luckily. The first one is the instrument pitch band range. And that's a setting for whenever you come across an instrument that doesn't use 48 as a per note pitch band range. There are MP instruments that doesn't use that, and there are other instruments that you can play with an MP controller that doesn't use 48 as a per note pitch band range. And then you can make that adjustment here. The last setting is the output target. If you want to limit the scope of this script to only output changes in CC74 pressure or pitch only, then you can set it here. Or if you want to do something weird with, say, the LFO stepper, you can also use this menu for that. But this is as much as goes into this script for now. And I actually don't intend to put too much more into it myself. But for anybody that's interested, this should work as a starting point, at least whetting your appetite for something like what the scripter can do for you. Of course, you need Logic to run in the background. Sometimes I just have Logic running in the background with the scripter, sending anything out on a Logic Pro virtual channel. You can just set it up as template with an external instrument and a scripter loaded on one track and have it in the background. Logic will create a virtual MIDI out and you can pick it up in Gig Performer or in Ableton. Just have it run in the background. You can feed the Jamstik into it, or you can have a channel with MIDI Guitar 3 already set up to work together with this if you want to, and feed instruments directly, or also actually sending to external instruments. But now you have a very, very competent MPE functionality also together with whatever you're using as a controller. This will be available, of course, on my Patreon, and I can't thank my patrons enough for having the patience to letting me sort of develop this, because this takes time. This has to be it for now, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Thank you.